to answer it in your head without writing anything down. If you think you got the answer correct, put a check mark, or if you know the answer, put a check mark. Don't go through all the rigmarole of writing it out, okay? Question number 1, can you quickly and clearly state 5 essential facts about the gospel message? Can you do that? Yes or no? Check if you can. Number 2, can you prove that all people are sinners and damned in God's sight? Yes or no? With a verse from Scripture. Number 3, can you answer the question, are the heathen really lost? Yes or no? I mean, a good answer. Do you know the answer to that? Are people in Swaziland that have never heard of Jesus Christ, are they lost and damned? Question number 4, can you explain 4 or 5 things that Jesus did for us when he died on the cross? 4 or 5 specific things that Jesus Christ did for us when he died on the cross. Can you do that? Question number 5. Wasn't God unjust in forgiving Old Testament sinners when in reality their sins hadn't really been taken away? Yes. Wasn't God being unjust in forgiving those people back in the Old Testament when their sins really weren't removed and taken away? Was he? Yes or no? If you think you got the correct answer to that, if you answered no, you got the correct answer. He was not unjust. Okay. Number 6, name 1 clear Old Testament example or person who is an example of faith for us today. 1 clear example of saving faith back in the Old Testament days. If you said Abraham, you got it. Or Noah. Or anybody else that's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. Next question. Was this number 7? Weren't the Jews saved only after being circumcised? Weren't the Jews saved only after being circumcised? Yes or no? If you said no, then you got the answer correct. All right. Could a Jew be saved if he broke a commandment that required the death penalty? Could a Jew be saved if he broke a commandment that required the death penalty? Yes or no? If you said yes, then you got the correct answer. Number 9, what does every person get from Adam when we are born? The answer is a dirty, rotten sin nature, or guilt, guaranteed death, however you want to put it. That's the correct answer. So give your check mark if you got that one right. Number 10, what does every believer get from Christ that cancels out what we got from Adam? What does every Christian get from Christ that cancels out what we got from Adam? Is it going through your head? If you said eternal life, then you got the right answer. All right? There may be one or question. Forgiveness? Okay. That would be fine. So give yourself a check mark if you got the right answer. Number 11, true or false? Since God is gracious, it doesn't matter how we live. If you said false, you got the right answer. Number 12, true or false? The only way to live victorious in the Christian life is to obey God's commandments. True or false? The only way to live victorious in the Christian life is to obey God's commandments. The answer to that one is false. That's the correct answer. False is the correct answer. Number 13, true or false? No Christian will ever be condemned by God. The answer to that is true. Number 14, if God chooses who he will to be saved, does he have any right to judge those who won't be saved? If God is the one that chooses the people who will be saved, does he have any right to judge the people that won't be saved? Yes or no? The answer to that question is yes, he has the right. Number 15, true or false? If a person is sincere and zealous in his or her attempts to be good, God will overlook their wrong ideas about salvation. In other words, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're sincere. Is that true or false? The answer to that one is false. Number 16. What does God's past dealings with the nation Israel teach us today about his dealings with non-Jews? Can you give an answer to that? What does God's past dealings with the nation Israel teach believers who are non-Jews today, or teach people who are non-Jews today? Oh, there are many things that could be said there, but one is that if you don't believe, you'll be judged. Okay? Or another answer to that question would be that the opportunities for salvation aren't unending. There is a limit to God's patience. That's another example, another answer to that question. Okay? Or another answer would be that God will exercise his severe justice towards you someday if you don't take the opportunity now. What question was that? 16. Number 17. What is every Christian's primary responsibility? What is every Christian's primary responsibility? The answer to that is given in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. If you said, commit yourself to the Lordship of Christ, or to submit to the Lordship of Jesus Christ, then you got the correct answer. Number 18. What must every Christian's service to fellow Christians include? What must every Christian's fellow service to other believers include? If you said the exercise of spiritual gifts, that is the desired answer. Or if you said love, that'd be another one. Okay? Right? Number 19. What are two responsibilities of every Christian to the state? Can you name two responsibilities you have to the government of Canada right now? And they are listed in one of the chapters of the book that we'll be studying for the next few weeks. One of them is to simply submit. Another is to honor them, respect them. Another is to pay your taxes. Okay? Those are Christians' responsibilities to the state. I hope you got that one correct. Give yourself a check mark if you had two right. Number 20, what are three principles that should guide Christians in their reactions to fellow believers when Christians disagree over what they should do or how they should act? What are three principles that should guide you in how you should respond to another Christian when that person and yourself disagree over how you should act in a particular situation? Three principles that guide your behavior. Can you state them? Yes or no? If you can't list three principles, then give yourself an X. That's a really important one. Number 21. What book has been called the chief book of the New Testament, the profoundest piece of writing in existence? What book has been called the chief book of the New Testament, and it has also been called the profoundest piece of writing in existence. Number 22. What book of the Bible was written to 6 or 7 house churches, all of which were found to be found in the same city? Pardon? Yes. What book of the Bible was written to 6 or 7 house churches, that is, households of Christians that met in a local house, all in one particular city? Oh, the next one, number 23. What book has the word gospel and the word righteousness as 2 of its key words? Can you name it? I hope some of you are getting the idea of where we're going to turn in our Bibles now. Number 24, we have 2 more. What New Testament book contains over 70 quotations from 14 Old Testament books? More than all the other letters in the New Testament combined. There is one book that makes more references to the Old Testament in itself than all the rest of the New Testament books put together. Very important book. Last question. This is a fill in the blank. Everybody likes fill in the blanks. The Gospel according to Paul, quote unquote, was written how many years after Christ died? Blank. Was written blank years after Christ died. How many years after Christ died? Oh, okay. This book that Paul wrote, which I'm calling the Gospel according to Paul, was written X number of years after Christ died. How many years after Christ died? During the 4th year of the Roman Emperor by name. Who was it? It was written from the city of, in Greece, near the close of Paul's which missionary journey? And was probably carried to the city of Rome by a woman named, who actually was a missionary from the town of, there. Now we have covered in 10 minutes all the background information to the book of Romans. How's that? The book of Romans. Please turn to the book of Romans this morning. The Gospel according to Paul was written 28 years after Jesus died on the cross, during the 4th year of the Roman Emperor Nero. It was written from the city of Corinth in Greece, at the close of Paul's 3rd missionary journey, and was probably carried to Rome by a woman named Phoebe, who was a missionary from the town of Cenchrea, which was just next door to Corinth. Now, if any of you would like elaborations on those questions, you can stay behind after church and have a detention for getting them wrong, and stay here and do penance. No. I hope that these questions have sparked an interest in your thinking regarding Paul's letter to the Romans. It's my purpose for the next 6 or 7 weeks to do a fast survey in the book of Romans. I did preach through the book of Romans back in about 1979 or 80. Some few of you will remember that, some of you who are ancient members at Northland Bible Chapel, for which we are very glad to have you this morning. And I took the liberty of preaching on the book of Romans for an entire year. Now, I think that the book of Romans is such a crucial book in the Bible that every Christian needs to have a grasp, a basic grasp of what the book of Romans is all about, because great issues are raised, some of which I have alluded to in the questions this morning. Some of you are new Christians that haven't been Christians all that long, and you don't really have a good understanding of the gospel. You may know facts, isolated facts about the gospel, but no one has ever helped you put it all together. You have difficulty explaining your faith to people who ask you. Or perhaps you are hesitant to share your faith simply because you don't know what to say about it. Perhaps some of you are wrestling with real issues in your personal spiritual life, unresolved issues like the justice of God and the problem of human suffering and the issue of whether the lost are really lost, or how can a Christian really be victorious in their personal life anyway? And how can a person claim to be a Christian and then turn around years later and act like they were never saved in the first place? And maybe the questions, such questions as, what are the most important things, what am I supposed to do now that I'm a Christian, may cross your mind. And the book of Romans is considered by many Bible commentators as one of the chief books in the Bible, one of the most profound pieces of writing in existence because it answers all of those issues. It puts it all in a nutshell in 16 chapters. As it says in the book of Jeremiah, there's a principle that confronts us today in the 20th century that confronted Israel in the 5th century before Christ. Thus saith the Lord, stand in the ways and see and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way? And walk in it, and you shall find rest for your souls. But Israel said, we will not walk in those old paths. There is much good reason. There are many good reasons to re-preach familiar things from the Bible, simply because we're creatures of forgetfulness. What's your middle name? Quick. No, that's a bad example. Everybody knows their middle name. But it's very possible for us to get fuzzy on things when we don't review them. And Jesus many times went over basic truths for his disciples. And he had to admonish them not to be so forgetful. The Apostle Peter, in the very place that Paul was quoting from this morning in his prayer, at the end of his life said, look at you people, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I do think I need to bring to your remembrance many of the things that you've already been taught. So the book of Romans for some of you will be a review. I hope that you will find it a refreshing review. We'll try to approach it a little differently than the last time we preached it. And for those of you who are not familiar with the book of Romans, I hope that at the end of our 6 or 7 weeks together that you will be able to think your way through the book of Romans, that some of these basic issues and questions regarding the gospel of Christ and Christian living will come into focus for you. If at any time you have questions, please drop them in the comment box. All right? If anything I say sparks a problem in your mind, please drop it there, and I may be able to use it and refer to it in an upcoming message. First of all, let me give you some special features about the book of Romans, and hopefully this morning we'll be able to take a quick survey of the first 3 chapters. And this is going to be unique for those of you who know me. Let's look quickly at an overview outline of the book of Romans. You can summarize everything in these 16 chapters in Romans under 5 points. The first is the one we're going to be looking at this morning, and that's basically that all of us are damned sinners. Now, I chose my words on purpose this morning. All of us are basically just damned sinners. That's Paul's main point. Not damn in the way that you would use the word, with a bad attitude towards somebody, but damned in the literal sense of the word. Damned, doomed, depraved, diabolical sinners in the sight of God. And we need to grasp that. And if you haven't grasped just how rotten you are, or just how rotten your mother-in-law is, or your neighbor is, who is such a nice humanitarian person and a member of the fire brigade and gives to charity and is an upstanding citizen, even a member of parliament, that person is rotten to the core and damned in God's sight. If you don't grasp that, you'll never understand the gospel. And I'd like to go one step further. You'll never understand the Christian life either. You have to understand man and what man is like. And that's what's so important about our study this morning. Next week we're going to look at what God did in providing for the desperate need of man in chapters 3 through 5. In chapters 6 through 8 in the book of Romans, Paul discusses the whole issue of how you as a Christian, once saved, can live victoriously. There are key principles to be established there that we hope to summarize in one study ahead. In chapters 9 through 11, Paul explains how Christianity today fits in with the overall plan and program of God. Why aren't you a Mormon this morning? Why aren't you a Mormon? I can tell you why I'm not a Mormon. Because the Mormons say that God has done away with the apostolic gospel and He's given us a new gospel that fits our times, revealed through Joseph Smith. That the old apostolic gospel of the Bible days is obsolete. Hogwash. If it was obsolete, there would have been some indication in the Bible that God was going to make it obsolete and do something different. And God surely made all kinds of indications in the Old Testament that He was going to come up with a gospel concerning His Son Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. This business of Christianity today fits hand in glove with the Old Testament. It was prepared. There were many steps laid out ahead of time. And so in chapters 9 to 11, Paul explains just how what God is doing today fits in with what He was doing in the past and what He's going to do in the future. In chapters 12 to 16, Paul summarizes exactly, in precise terms, the major areas of responsibility for you as a Christian. What you are supposed to be doing as a Christian. He leaves nothing up in the air. He just lays it out in plain terms. Your relationship to God is primary. Your relationship to the church is secondary. Your relationship to the government of this world and society in general is tertiary, right? And then he talks about your interrelationship to your fellow brothers and sisters in the faith, how you get along with people. He gives you principles on how to guide you. Very, very important questions. And we can't afford to ignore any of these key topics which are foundational to the book of Romans. The theme of the book of Romans is the word gospel. You're in Romans chapter 1, I hope. Look at the very first verse of the book. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which He had promised before by His prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And he goes on and on describing the gospel. Look at verse 9. God is my witness, Paul writes, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of His Son. Verse 15. So as much as in me is, Paul says, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. Verse 16. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Chapter 2, verse 16. He refers to the day in the future when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. And 12 times in the book of Romans, Paul refers to the gospel and describes it different ways. In one place he calls it the gospel of God. In another place the gospel of Christ. In another place the gospel, which implies something. The gospel, what does that imply? There's only one. There's only one message that's true, that leads to life. It's unique. There are no parallels. There are not two ways. There is only one message of life. He calls it the gospel of Christ, describing the main person, the main theme, the main subject. That's why Jehovah's Witnesses are so lost, because they go around in great zeal and diligence, knocking on doors and trying to spread good news. And they leave Jesus Christ out of it. It doesn't make sense at all. At all. There's no good news if you haven't got Jesus Christ. Jesus makes everything worthwhile. See? Paul calls it my gospel, which stresses the unique explanation and perspective on the gospel that he, as a human agent, was used by the Holy Spirit to give to us. He calls it the gospel of peace in 10:15, which describes the primary result of this message. What happens in your life when you believe the gospel? You should have peace. you don't have peace this morning, it's because you've never received the gospel of Christ, or you're kicking the traces as a supposed follower of Christ. Well, anyway, the gospel is the key words of the book of Romans. That's why some people have called this the gospel of Paul, the gospel according to Paul. We have the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark, and Luke, and John. And now when we come to the book of Romans, we don't have another life of Christ, but we do have a detailed, fantastic exposition of the ins and the outs of the Christian faith. Just how it all fits together, what its key components are, and how it relates. The gospel according to Paul. The key verses to the book are the verse in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, which you've already looked at, but let's reread them carefully for a moment. Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it, the gospel, is God's power to salvation to everyone that believes. To Jew first and also to the Greek. For in the gospel is God's righteousness revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Here Paul relates many of the key elements in his book. He tells us that you get the gospel by faith. He describes the gospel as centering on Christ. It's something that you don't need to be ashamed of. It's wonderful, it's great, it's fantastic, it makes sense. The gospel is the only way that you can be made righteous. And when you become righteous, guess what? God expects you to live by faith. And it all ties in on the message of the gospel. So, key verses. 43 times in the book of Romans, Paul refers to righteousness, or similar terms. This is a dominant concept. He starts out, as I said, which we're going to look at this morning, in the first 3 chapters, established the sad reality that normal human beings are separated from God. They're damned. They're depraved. They're rotten. No, every way you look at it, people haven't got a chance in their own ability. We're going to establish that this morning before we leave. And so the real need is for us to become righteous, to get something that we don't have. We are like a bunch of big zeros, like big empty pots. There's nothing good in us. There is no righteousness there. We're all empty. Right? We need to be recycled. Right? And when God does a recycling job, He makes a whole new container. See? And He fills you with something good. See? Salvation is a plus and minus. Right? You're born minus, and when you're saved, you get plus. Right? It's as simple as that. That's where righteousness comes in. That's something we never have naturally. All right, let's talk about it. We're in Romans chapter 1, and I want to survey Paul's argument here, his line of thought, through chapters 1b through chapter 3a. Okay, are you ready to go? Fasten your seatbelts, put your mind in gear, wake up, come on. Everybody with me? In the first chapter, and in the first 11 verses of chapter 2, Paul is making one basic point. And that is that nature's message, the trees and the rocks and the skies and the planets and the moon and the sun, and indeed your own body, the makeup of the human person, argues something. What is that? There is a God. But that's not Paul's main point. He simply starts with that. He says, nature proves that there's a God. God exists. He's great. He's powerful. He's personal. He's triune. He is greater than man and like man. If you can think abstract thoughts, surely God is not merely a rock. Right? God has to be something like us, only greater, to bring us into existence. He too thinks abstract thoughts. He too loves. He's not merely material, he is spiritual. Right? We're getting a little bit deeper into theology than I wanted to go here, but the point is that nature points to certain characteristics about God, and guess what? What do your neighbors do with the message of nature? They go, thumbs up to that. I don't believe in that. I believe in evolution. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and worship creation instead of the Creator. That's Paul's first point in this book. He says everybody's done it in general, and he gets really specific in chapter 2, and he points to the individual. Now, I made my point. Let's read it. God is angry with this world today. He is not happy at all. Because people have screwed up. They have taken his message in nature and turned it thumbs down and turned it around upside down. Look at it. The wrath of God, verse 18, is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's precisely what is happening in the educational system today. Instead of being fair and offering a two-model approach to origins, our current system will not allow the teachers, by and large, to preach or to teach creationism. Now, there may be exceptions. There probably are. But by and large, most kids never hear about creationism. It's suppressed. And the doctrine, the satanic, atheistic, agnostic, humanistic, anti-God philosophy of evolution is supplanted for creationism. Right? Everybody knows what evolutionism is? There is no God. We're here by chance. We're an accident. Okay? If you ever want to hear something wonderful on the subject of humanism and creationism, get a tape by Frank Peretti, the author of This Present Darkness. I heard it's played on Dobson this week on my way across the bridge to a meeting. And that guy is hilarious. It's beautiful. So anyway, if you ever get a chance to listen to Frank Peretti, he's better on audio than he is in the book. And the books are not that bad either. So anyway, God is angry with people because people have suppressed the truth and unrighteousness. They hold down this idea. What is it they suppress? Look at verse 19. That which may be known of God is manifest among them, that is mankind. God has shown himself to them. The invisible things about God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made. Even his eternal power and Godhead, so that man is without excuse. This fits hand in glove with what we read in the Old Testament, Psalm 19, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no place or tongue, I think, where their voice is not heard. You can't go anywhere in this world, even if it's to the Sahara Desert, and not see the handwork of God. God exists. So what is that supposed to do? God expects people to look out there and to draw a simple conclusion. God, I know you're here. God says people are inexcusable if they draw any other conclusion. They are without excuse. And even worse, verse 21. Because when people knew God, they recognized him, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. We're talking about people in general. Most people in the world are like this. They became vain in their imagination. Their foolish heart was dark, and professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and they became idolaters, basically. Now, you can read as good as I can, but if you read verses 24 to 32 at the end of chapter 1, guess what? Paul says, you know what society becomes like when they start with that presupposition? It becomes just like Goulais River in 1990, or Toronto, or San Francisco, or New York. People's thinking gets all warped. And they begin to turn sex around and become homosexuals and lesbians. They begin to enjoy vice instead of virtue. They begin to exalt all that is corrupt and putrid instead of following God. And I talked about this Friday night around the campfire. Your mind is where the battle is really taking place. And the minds of unsaved men, when they reject the existence of God through the message of nature, God just turns the switch to off. He goes, click, you're done. It says God gives you over to a reprobate mind to perform acts that are unfitting to the human being. That's what he says in verse 28. Even as they did not like to even think about God in their knowledge, God gave them to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not fitting. And he describes our society to a T. I usually enjoy watching the Journal, but not on Friday nights, because Friday nights they always have a thing on the arts. And if you want a commentary on the filth and degradation and perversion of our society, just watch that program once or twice, and you begin to see how screwed up people's thinking is. And these people make it sound so intellectual and great, you know, the expression of freedom of speech and all this crap. It's really pathetic. I'm not against freedom of speech, but I think it ought to be governed by moral laws. Anyway, before I become a politician, Paul simply says, people that take this approach to God, guess what? He says they basically get minds that are so warped and turned off that they know that they're going to be judged subconsciously, he says in verse 32, but they go ahead and enjoy themselves anyway. Hey boys, go back to Sunday school. Right. So when we come to chapter 2, the Apostle Paul takes a little breather here, and he takes a different approach. He sort of walks out of the pulpit, and he walks over to this nice young lady sitting in the armchair over here, watching all this garbage on television, who's saying, oh, those idiots, those perverts, I'm not like that. You know, we tend to look at everybody else's faults, don't we? Right? We become armchair referees. How many like to watch football? How many like to play football? How many would like to play pro football? No way. But we like to disagree with the decisions of the referee, right? It's easy to project ourselves mentally in somebody else's situation and condemn that person. Oh, I would never become a homosexual. So what does Paul do? He just turns the mirror around and he says, look at yourself for a minute, pal. Chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore you, individual, are inexcusable, O man, whosoever you as an individual are. He's been talking about all kinds of other people in chapter 1, plural, they. Now he gets individual and specific, and he says, you are inexcusable, whoever you are, that's sitting in your armchair judging all these other people. See what he's done? Turns the mirror on you. For wherein you judge another person, you condemn yourself. He says, as soon as you become a self-appointed judge, you also become a self-appointed criminal. Why? Because all you people sitting in your armchairs condemning all these other people has done the same things. You have sinned just as bad, for thou that judgest doest the same things. Now you're going to say, no, I haven't committed homosexuality. No, but you've probably lusted once in your life at least. You probably coveted something that belonged to your neighbor once in your life at least, right? You probably have gotten angry at God at some point in your life and said something that you shouldn't have said to God in your mind or in your heart, right? All of us have committed abominable acts. We have all become, at one point or another, we've worshipped the creation. There isn't a person in this room that hasn't worshipped something in creation during your lifetime instead of worshiping God. Maybe it's your face you worship. Maybe it's your figure. Maybe it's your bank account. Maybe it's your prestige, your position at your job, whatever it is. Sometimes those things, when they become all important to us, we begin to worship them. God doesn't get his due respect. So Paul develops this in verses 1 to 11. He basically argues that God's just sense of justice is something that never warps. It stays constant. The last thing he says in verse 11 regarding individuals who stand at his judgment bar is that there is no respect of person with God. God doesn't discriminate. I don't care if you're a senior citizen, a little nice little old widow lady that never hurt anybody all your life. If you rejected his son, same judgment. And the principles of divine judgment are listed in chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. Divine judgment is based on truth. It's based on God's long suffering. It's based on the facts. You know? Look at verse 4. Do you despise the riches of God's goodness and forbearance and long suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance? After thy hardness and impenitent heart, that's just as bad as these other things. You treasure up to yourself wrath against the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to every man, woman, or child according to his deeds. Judgment is always based on evidence. God is building up evidence right now. Every time you do something wrong, it's written down in a book. I believe. It says in Revelation chapter 20 that not just the book of life is open, it says the books are open. Revelation 13:8 talks about the Lamb's book of life. In one place it talks about, I will not blot his name out of the Lamb's book of life. In another place it writes the name in. I'm not really positive about all that what's going to happen, but I do know that God's judgment of his creatures is always fair and above board. It's always based on an unchanging standard, and that is his truth, his law, which we haven't gotten to. But the point is that people know. Tell me, what did people do before Moses received the law on Mount Sinai? Remember, Moses lived about the 15th century BC, and thousands of people lived before Moses was ever born, before God's law was ever given. So can God judge those people? Does God hold all those people that lived from Adam to Moses through several thousand years of human history? On what basis are they judged? Is God going to judge them according to his Mosaic law that they never heard of? You ever thought about that? What is the grounds of divine judgment? Now Paul proceeds to show that there isn't a person who's ever lived who hasn't lived and died and operated during his lifetime according to some legal standard. Everybody, even the people that never heard of Moses' law, there were laws in their societies. And they're sinners, they're condemned according to their own laws. The Jews who lived from Moses' day onward to this very present time, they got 613 commandments revealed in the Old Testament. And there isn't a Jew ever, except for one, that kept all those commandments. So the Jews blew it. And that's Paul's conclusion. Basically, I just finished my message. Aren't you glad? I'd like to elaborate a little bit. Look at verse 12. Let's read verses 12 to 15 in chapter 2. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. It's not the hearers of the law that are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles who have not the law, key verse here, when the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. And he wraps it up saying that written law is codified basically in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me elaborate. There were people that lived before Moses that never heard of the Mosaic law. And Paul is saying, guess what? These people are going to be judged on the basis of God's law, regardless of whether they ever heard of Moses' commandments or not. Because every society has its own law. There is such a thing as natural law. Right? You don't have to live in Canada to know that it's wrong to kill somebody. I mean, anywhere you go in the world, it's wrong to kill somebody just because you don't like their looks. Right? Everybody agree? That's natural law. It's natural law. We have a conscience. Every human being is born with a conscience. No matter what happens to their conscience after birth, we're still born with conscience. And everybody knows naturally that it's wrong to rape a woman. That it's wrong to take something that belongs to another person. That's natural law. And against such virtues, there is no law, Galatians chapter 6 says. That ordinarily people, until they get really depraved, they do have a sense of right and wrong. Every society has its laws. I don't care if you're talking about a tribe in the Philippines, way up on the mountain somewhere, or whether you're talking about Canadian society, or whether you're talking about Soviet society. We all have laws, right? They're not necessarily the Ten Commandments, but they're all laws. Now, question. Have you ever kept all the statutes of the province of Ontario to a T? Even according to natural law, there isn't one person that is sinless. That's Paul's point. When you're talking about law, there is natural law. These people that never had Moses' law are just as guilty before God because their own conscience proves they've broken their own laws, right? You could set your own family up as a little microcosm of society, make your own laws, separate yourself, isolate yourself into the bush somewhere, and guess what? You break your own laws.